Okay, everyone, I think we're going to begin. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining JNF today for our JNF Town Hall with our very special guest, Mayor John Tory. Although we all may have moved indoors, there have been so many ways to keep our minds stimulated and entertained, which is why JNF has been offering webinars such as today's for the past few weeks. The JNF Toronto Board is hard at work planning for this year's summer golf tournaments and the negative dinner. Of course, there will be modifications necessary to our traditional offerings, but in the end, our goal is to raise funds to build projects for the benefit of the people of Israel. We hope that you will join us at these events once the official announcements are made. We are honored to have Mayor Tory, a former JNF Negative Dinner honoree, with us today to give the JNF community a city update, as well as answer any questions you may have during this time. We ask that you keep your mics muted during the mayor's address. A Q&A session will take place after his remarks, which will be moderated by myself. Questions sent in advance for today's webinar will be answered first, but feel free to send in questions to me via the chat for the mayor to address. Without further ado, I'd like to call on the Mayor of Toronto, John Tory, who's been leading us during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks again, Mayor, and the floor is yours.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much. And may I begin by saying thank you to JNF. You know me and I know you well, and I was so honored to be an honoree a number of years ago. And you know what was even better for me was, and I can be someone who offers a testimonial anytime, because a lot of the times people don't get a chance to see the projects that are supported by their generosity. I had just lost my father at the time that I was honored, and just in that previous year, I think. And so I chose something that had to do with helping kids with autism, where Israel leads the way in the world in terms of these kind of combined residential and treatment and work centers. And I named a therapy garden after him. And of course, then had the chance in one of my visits to Israel to actually go and see it. And it was an incredibly moving experience for me. But what was more interesting was that, you know, sometimes when you're supporting something like this, you don't know what it's going to look like when you actually get there. And, you know, sometimes in some places you might even be uncertain, not with JNF, but you might be uncertain as to whether it's even going to be there. And I got there and it was a place of great beauty and tranquility. And the center that it is beside is a world leading center in terms of caring for kids in particular that are affected by autism. And it's funny how the world unfolds. I saw that and I was very moved by that. And because I'd chosen to name it after my father, or you did, and I came back and maybe a couple of years later had one of our grandchildren, I guess it's our fourth grandchild, and she turns out to be on the autism spectrum. So it's funny how these things turn out in life. But you do good work after good work, dinner after dinner. I think this year's dinner, as I recall, is going to do a lot of good work at home as well as in Israel. And I am very thankful for that too, because you are people who, by definition, build up the city as well as building up the state of Israel. I, by the way, was scheduled to go to Israel in July. And because of the nature of foreign travel these days, I won't be going, but I'll be looking to reschedule that trip as soon as possible. So on the pandemic, I'm not going to bore you with a long dissertation on this. We'll leave more time for questions. I will say from the beginning, what we set out to do was first and foremost to stop the spread of the virus and to save lives. And, you know, we had a tragic loss of life notwithstanding, but I can just assure you, had we not done the things we did and you not done the things you've done with regard to self distancing and staying home from work and so forth, we would have had, based on the projections I saw, which I can tell you, imagine sitting in a room on a Saturday morning and being told that the death toll in your city, where, as you know, we're lucky enough that we don't have earthquakes and hurricanes here, really. The death toll was perhaps going to be upwards of 4,000 people in the city of Toronto. And it was on that day that I resolved we were going to do everything we could to save lives on the advice of the medical officer of health. And so we took the measures that have caused a lot of you to be at home and to be cooped up and to have your kids not going to school and all those things that you're more than familiar with at this stage. But I think it has helped to save a lot of lives. We've still lost almost 700 lives so far in the city of Toronto, which, if you think about it, is an extraordinary number by any measure. But we've stopped the spread of this, I think, to a large extent. We also had to keep city services going in the city, which we've done. I mean, things had to carry on simply because the water has to turn on, the police have to come, the fire department, the parks have to, you know, be kept even if they're not fully open. And we can talk about that if you wish. Thirdly, we had to make sure that we protected the healthcare system, because there was a real fear, had you ever got to the stage, for example, where 4,000 people were ill enough that they might lose their lives, it was going to overwhelm the healthcare system. And we had to sort of, the reason for flattening the curve, as you've heard that expression, was as much to protect the healthcare system as to save lives, and to do both at the same time. And then finally, we had a job to do, which is now really just beginning, to protect our way of life, which means to protect the economy, protect people's livelihoods, and take the steps as soon as it was prudent to do so, to reopen the economy and to take the shutdown restrictions off of the city. Where are we today? We're at a stage where, to be perfectly frank with you, the Toronto GTA numbers have not improved as much as the rest of the province. Frankly, the rest of the province had a situation where in a place like St. Thomas near London, they've had 4 cases. In Kingston, they had 1. I think at one time they had 0. And so, needless to say, their challenge in dealing with this, their desire to get back to a more normal way of life was more intense than ours, where we, even yesterday, had hundreds of new cases and several more deaths, unfortunately. So we're trying to calibrate with the province the right way to kind of lift the restrictions and get the economy opened up in a way that's responsible and that allows us to, navigate through uncharted waters. We've never had a complete shutdown of the economy like this, thank God. Hopefully we'll never have it again. But if you did it too fast and risked a second spread, I think we'd be way sorrier when we're sitting here in November when the Negev dinner is supposed to be on, with the city shut down again, dinners like that not able to be held, the economy, in worse shape than it is today because you've been shut down a second time. So we're really trying to kind of calibrate all of that in a way that takes account of all of that and watches, and first and foremost, the health numbers, even more so than the economic numbers, knowing that the economic numbers are a very serious matter. So that's kind of where we are. And I know you have some granular questions about different aspects of life in Toronto that I'll try to answer. Needless to say, we're trying to get back as many services, as many things, as many aspects of life and the economy as quickly as we possibly can. There's no desire to delay things for the sake of doing so. Why would we do that? So we're trying to do that, but it requires a degree of patience and a degree of staying the course for a little while longer in terms of the social distancing and so on. And I'm sure that'll come out during the course of the questions on individual aspects of life that you would like to see addressed sooner or later, or faster or slower. So thank you for the opportunity again. Thank you so much for what JNF does, Jeff, and you and your whole team and all the people who are donors and supporters, and on with the question period.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Tory. So we have a series of questions about when things are going to open and things like that. And we do understand that there's obviously you have to deal with the province. But my first question actually that isn't here is, how much discretion do you or does the city have in determining what things can open and what can't vis-a-vis the provincial policy?
Well, it's kind of interesting because under the law, to give you an example of restaurants and bars, we actually don't have the power to issue a blanket order to close all restaurants and bars. The province does. What we had the power to do right from the beginning was to strongly recommend they close, and then to issue individual orders if there were restaurants that failed to comply and that we thought they were a bad example. And so what we did is we issued that strong recommendation and said we would issue individual orders, but we called upon the province way back in early March to issue a blanket order on restaurants and bars, which they did. So that I guess the answer to your question is that if you wanted to address the thing in a blanket way, the provincial order has to come off. But we would still have the authority after that. For example, we have two sets of orders on playgrounds. So if they decided to remove theirs, but we did not remove ours, or vice versa, then the playground still wouldn't open. And so I'm just saying that I think it's a team effort. Their order and their power to give orders is broader than ours. And so their orders are probably more important in the sense that they would affect more things more in a blanket way, whereas our orders tend to often be more targeted. Although on things like playgrounds, which fall into our domain, they're very blanket. So I think we're having to work together, and we're trying to do that because we think it'd be very confusing for the public to hear one set of orders come off and have another one stay on. So we're trying to do these things together. So when you saw them take the order off-leash dog parks the other day, you may say, well, who cares about that? Well, hundreds and thousands of people who have dogs do, and we have 70 of those in Toronto. We moved right away to open them up. We could have said, no, we're going to keep those closed because for some reason we think dogs shouldn't be running around off leash in those parks, but we didn't. We moved quickly to open them, as we're doing with tennis courts this coming weekend and so forth. So we're trying to work together.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So speaking of playgrounds, the first question we got was, when do you think they'll reopen, and specifically water parks as well?
I think you'll see playgrounds within the month. I don't mean the month of May, within the month from now. So say sometime between now and mid-June. And it's really subject to the confidence we have in the ability of people to manage their own kids. And kids are harder. They don't know what physical distancing is, and you can't explain it to a 6-year-old very easily. And then secondly, the ability of adults to show a degree of personal responsibility, because when the adults hang around the playground with the kids, they tend to congregate in groups. And I think what people haven't understood, they've come to understand better, the fact that you could be standing with 6 adults, all of whom say, I'm a picture of health, not realizing that one of those has the virus and just hasn't shown any symptoms, which is quite commonplace. And by standing there talking in a very narrow circle, given that it is the transmission of the water droplets from your mouth, even in normal conversation, that transmits the virus, that you are actually potentially infecting 3 other people who will go home to their homes and infect their relatives unknowingly, and so on and so forth. And so I think you'll have playgrounds in June sometime. That's my guess. I think the water features will come a little bit later, not because water poses any particular danger, but just because I think they're by definition congregate settings. Lots of people pack those pools and pack the outside of those pools in the summer. So I think we'll be making a big effort to get those open for the heart of summer. Playgrounds maybe a bit before.
Okay, great. Are there any plans for increased affordable housing or any planned programs to help those who can't afford rent once the pandemic ends?
Yes, I mean, part of the problem, of course, is that you can't build housing on on the drop of a hat. It takes a long time to build it. Now, one of the reasons we've moved to do what I think of as a fairly significant experiment with modular housing, which is like a Lego set that's prefab housing that's lifted into place and built. And there's a good example of affordable housing in Vancouver that they established doing a modular housing. We've placed the order, and the units in our case are under construction, 250 of them. And you may say, well, that's a pretty small number, and you'd be right. But the purpose of the 250 is to, in 2 different groups, 2 different little developments, is to prove that it works for us, to prove that it can be installed here well, that it can fit within the neighborhoods. And I think that would allow us to speed up the process of building more affordable housing. But I guess I should just say to you, the people that are watching out there and those who asked the question, we are really trying to kind of repurpose the money we're spending and take it away from the old way, which I kind of inherited and I've carried on with for a number of years, which is putting homeless people in hotel rooms and having a huge long waiting list for affordable housing, and move that over to situations where instead of spending our money on hotel rooms, we'll spend it on maybe buying a building that we can turn into affordable housing or supportive housing, or using modular units, which we can build from scratch on city land very quickly. So the answer is yes, we're taking advantage of the pandemic to do as much as we can. And I think we are going to have some help from the federal government, who see this as an opportunity, both in terms of housing, but also economic stimulus, to do some things that will provide us with at least those 2 benefits: economic stimulus in Toronto and more affordable and supportive housing.
Okay, thank you. So as you, I'm sure, are aware, there's been a number of disappointed couples that postponed their weddings due to the pandemic. When do you think weddings of reasonable sizes will be permitted?
There's 2 issues there. One is the issuance of a permit, because you theoretically can't get married without a permit, even I guess in a synagogue or a church, theoretically. And so I would say that with regard to the permits, I raised this morning because I said of all the things we could get going again, because what we're trying to do at City Hall is stage the return to normal services and stage the return to work of our employees. We're saying to the top 25 employers in the city, please do not send your employees back to work any sooner than you have to. And we're saying that because we don't want to place an undue strain on the transit system, for example, all at once. And the city is included in that list of top 25 employers in the city. So we're saying we're going to stage the return to work of our employees. But I made the case this morning that of all the things people would say they care about, especially in the month of, say, June, it would be the ability to get a wedding license. And you've still been able to get one during the pandemic, but it was on urgent circumstances if somebody was leaving the country or, whatever. So I'd like to get that office running again as normally as possible, as soon as possible, meaning in the next 10 days or so. With regard to the size of weddings, I will only say to you that, and this is just my guess, but it's my educated guess, educated meaning I hear a lot of the discussions. I think big weddings of 200 or 300 people will not be permitted again and be in vogue again for health reasons until maybe towards the end of the year. I think we're going to go through a fall period, summer and fall period, where the number of people in a group ramps up from what it is at 5 today to 10 or 15 to 25 to 50 to 100. So if you're having a 100-person wedding, I think you'll find in the summer we'll probably get there. But if you're saying you're going to have a 500-person wedding, I think it may be into the fall, sort of considered along with theaters, concerts, where it's just not going to be, if we've canceled the CNE because it's a crowd scene, then it's a smaller crowd scene to have 500 people at a wedding or at a concert or at a theater performance. So we're going to have to find ways to deal with that within the context of not having a second wave of the virus. So I think big weddings will be the fall, wedding permits will be the spring. Spring means before summer, which comes on June 21st.
Well, my niece, who had to postpone her wedding, is happy to hear that. When do you think, well, it's a 2-part question, actually. When do you think malls will open? And secondly, will the number of people allowed into the malls be restricted or will it be open and then the individual stores will restrict the number of people?
I think it's going to have to be a bit of both, but I think it's more important. The better way to control it, obviously, is individual stores because they're smaller premises and just because it's more manageable for each store owner to or store operator to control people going into the stores. As for the when for malls, I think maybe, again, I would say it's in the next phase, which will, I think, come sometime like around middle to end of June. That's my guess. In terms of controlling the access to the malls by people coming into the mall itself and whether you're going to put a limit on that, don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if there's an attempt to do that, but that really the sort of the where the action is going to be at the store level where you're going to cause people not to be in stores. But again, if the objective from our standpoint, from a public health point of view only, it's nothing to do with us not wanting people to have a good time. I know a lot of people go to malls as an outing. If the objective is to prevent crowd scenes that encourage the spread of the virus, then you'll find those kind of gatherings where larger numbers of people are present more likely to have rules and regulations attached to them. Even when we've opened our tennis courts, which will open, I think, on Saturday or sometime around this weekend, the provincial order that allows them to be open says that it can be only singles, not doubles. Again, only because it was felt that if you had doubles, you've got 4 people that are very close together playing tennis, and that might be dangerous if one of them happened to be carrying the virus.
Okay. So one of the things that people are missing the most really is interacting with other families, having a Shabbat dinner or just a night together.
Passover was virtual this year.
Exactly. So when do you think the one household bubble will expand to 2, where at least 2 families can sort of have a dinner together or
it was under active discussion. It was under active discussion as part of the announcement that the Premier made last Friday, and when I say at the last minute, it just didn't happen. And I think it didn't happen out of concern. I mean, I think a lot of this, and I'm very happy about this, and I'm going to be quite insistent that for the next series of relaxations of the rules, that it should be based on easily understood health numbers so that all of us know the threshold for new infections and for ICU cases and hospitalized cases and so on, whatever the factors are well known to people so they know we're either meeting the test or we're not. And I think in the end, they decided that since the numbers were still bubbling up a little bit in terms of new infections in Ontario, they wouldn't do what they had talked about doing, which was to say, add a second bubble in. I don't know whether all of you out there know, because you've read about New Brunswick, how this works, but you can just imagine, maybe you just assume this never comes along, because for families, like we have 4 kids, and in New Brunswick, what they said is, well, you get to pick once who the second family is you bubble with. It doesn't have to be your own family. It could be your friends, your next door neighbors. But they've said, imagine the complications that's creating where you do pick the next door family and not your own family, and they haven't been to see you for weeks, and that causes fuss. Or imagine if you had to pick one sibling out of the 4 kids you have, or whatever number you have, and what do the other 3 think about that? Because you can't mix and match. So I think that it's going to come in the next series of announcements. It could come before that, but I think it will be sometime in the next 2 to 4 weeks. I think that will be accompanied in all likelihood, and I'm just saying what my instinct is, by some increase in the group size from 5 to some slightly higher number. I think it'll go higher than 10, because from 5 to 10, sure, allows you to have Shabbat dinner or whatever, but it doesn't really allow for any kind of a meeting to take place of a charity or a JNF board meeting or things like that. So I think that's what you'll see in the next 4 weeks. You'll see the second bubble thing quite potentially come in here, and you will see an increase in the group size from 5 to something bigger to allow for more groups to get together or to have even just a family dinner.
Okay, great. That's good news. So let's concentrate on the children for a second. I know a number of people were disappointed when the city canceled day camps this summer and other programs. Do you think there's a possibility that maybe for the second month for August that day camps could reopen? And on a similar front, when do you think daycare centers will start accepting children? It's going to be hard for people to go back to work if daycare is not available.
I mean, I name, in terms of the recovery of the city and the reopening of the city, the 2 biggest issues for us are the transit system and making sure it doesn't get overwhelmed within the context of physical distancing, and childcare. Because obviously, as you said, people can't go back to work, or not as easily. Maybe one person gets to go back and the other doesn't, because somebody's got to look after the kids. With regard to the camps, I'll give you a slightly more optimistic statement even than you offered, which is that we're trying, subject to the health numbers, to organize a series of camps that are appropriately physically distanced, not earlier than mid-July. So it is possible if things go well on the numbers and we do well on the reorganization of the camps. The reason we canceled them all was because it was easier for us, given the realities that we would have to make significant adjustments to those camps in terms of physical distancing, kids staying in the same cohort of kids all the time so they're not mixing around with other kids, increased staffing likely, especially for little kids that don't understand physical distancing. With all those considerations, we came to the conclusion that we probably wouldn't be able to look after all of the 90,000 kids that had signed up. And so we canceled everything on the basis that it was easier to cancel everything and start over again. The model that we're working on now, which we call Camp TO, I call it Plan B, that would start, say, not earlier than mid-July, would only be able to look after 45,000 kids, but nonetheless, 45,000 kids. And so we're working on that really hard, and I think you'll have to know sort of at least a month ahead of that, so you'd have to know in June so people could sign up and all the rest. The private day camps, if I can call it like the ones that are not run by the city, they were allowed by the province yesterday, subject to some very strenuous guidelines on physical distancing, which I think will lead to some of those camps having to change as well. They won't be able to necessarily look after as many kids. The same is true for childcare. Childcare, the province has indicated yesterday, will be allowed to open at some point not too long from now on the same basis as the emergency childcare centers that have been opened by and run by us in Toronto during the pandemic. I won't bore you with all the details except to say that there are very strict limits on how many kids can be in those childcare centers, very strict ratios for the staff and so on, all of which would mean for many of the 1,000 licensed childcare centers in Toronto, 1,000 in Toronto, they would have to make substantial changes, which in turn would change their business, because some of them are privately run and have a budget that is predicated on so many kids being in the center with so many staff. If you change all that around, even in terms of physical space, you're going to have a real challenge for that industry. So I would assume that you're going to find that it's still a while yet before childcare opens, because we have to take the guidelines we've been given and implement those on a business-like basis. And so it takes time, obviously, to do that.
So one question we received is, are you anticipating a second wave from what you've heard from the medical people?
Yes, yes. I mean, they basically refer to it as something that is going to be a fact. The question is it a second wave that is of, if you go back to the Spanish flu in the early 20th century, the second or third wave, I believe, were worse than the first one. Our objective is to say, given that it is almost inevitable with a virus like this for which you don't yet have a vaccine, you're going to see a second wave, or at least eruptions here and there, that it turns out to be isolated eruptions and a very modest second wave. But one of the things that our medical officer of health, who's does such a fine job for us, I think, Dr. Davila, one of the things she's taught me is that in a virus like this, unlike the flu or other viruses, we don't know anything about this one. It is astounding for us to think about this now, but it was literally discovered, like 100 days ago. Just discovered. It didn't even exist before that, as far as people knew. And so I think that they're almost unanimous in saying there will be some kind of a second wave. The objective for us is to keep it as small as possible, hence the caution that we've gone about reopening the city and all these things like restrictions on people playing tennis and restrictions on people on public transit and so forth, is to sort of stop crowd scenes and other places where the virus can transmit itself.
Next question is, can you comment on the current situation in long-term care homes? And does the city have any plan to increase the number of beds under the city's responsibility?
Well, we could. The requirement under the law is that every city has to operate at least one municipal long-term care home residence. We have 10. And our 10, we had a couple that had some tragic loss of life in them. And I've just been reading a draft report last night that talks about what happened. We were actually fortunate in that many of our residences that we own and operate were actually spared the COVID-19, and certainly spared deaths and spared in many cases all but a handful or less of infections. Do we have any plans to operate any further residences? Not at the moment. What we're in the midst of doing, and I think this was a factor, it will be found when they examine what happened here. We're in the process of spending hundreds of millions of dollars refurbishing some of the ones we already own. None of them are really, really, really old, which is true in rural Ontario. Have very old residences that are really not up to current standards. And that will, I think, come out as one of the, again, things that we have to fix in Ontario as a whole. But in Toronto, we're refurbishing them so that the concept, for example, of rooms that have multiple residents in them a breeding ground for the transmission of any infection, will have to be done away with. And you'll have to reconfigure these buildings and provide greater places for isolation and provide for more isolation to begin with. Admittedly, that causing some social dislocation for the older people who sometimes find having a roommate comforting to them. And so we're in the midst of really, and I think we'll focus our minds rather than expanding the number. We're on the top of our men's shelter, for example, on George Street. We're tearing it down. It's called Seton House at present. We're tearing it down and building a new one. And it is going to have 4 or 5 floors of long-term care on top of it, so that the homeless people, who are often people that get to an age where they're infirm and in need of long-term care, can have a place where they can be sheltered properly over time. So we'll be doing expansions like that, but mostly I think what we'll be focused on is renovating the ones we have and making the changes I think we're going to have to make to take account of different concerns about staffing, about the configuration of the buildings and so on, to make sure that if there's a next pandemic or even a big second wave, that we have made the changes we have to make to stop the loss of life we saw in Toronto and elsewhere around Canada from happening again.
Well, it's actually great to hear that the city's long-term care facilities weren't as drastically affected. That's good. That's good news. But why do you think it got out of hand in so many other places?
Well, when I read the reports, I think it's almost the nature of how everybody operated them. I mean, first of all, we allowed people to come and go quite freely from those places. And if you think about a population, namely elderly, frail people, because that's why they're in long-term care, and they were deemed from the beginning to be the most vulnerable population because they're older and because they're frail. Many of them, most of them, have pre-existing health conditions. The notion of having people coming in and out, whether it be visitors or staff, and I'll come back to the staff question in a minute, was something that made it more likely something was going to happen. The more people you have coming and going, the more the virus is going to come in the same front doors. Secondly, you had a situation where in our long-term care residences, for example, we had 2/3 of the staff were part-time workers, and 1/3 of those worked in multiple settings in long-term care. Again, as we moved through the loss of life, you saw all of the long-term care, private and public, move to saying you can only work in one place. And that, again, reduces the chance you're going to go from one place to the other and bring the virus with you. And so I think that it was situations like that that contributed, plus the congregate setting. You've seen that the other place where we had some outbreaks was in shelters. Why? Because you have people who live in close quarters with each other, as was the case in long-term care. They eat their meals together, as was in the case in long-term care. And so I think we have to rethink all of those things, at least when you see any hint of some kind of a breakout, whether it's an outbreak, whether it's of the flu or of a new virus, is what do you do about staffing? What do you do about eating and other settings, congregate settings? I'll give you another example. We did not have, in a couple of the city-owned long-term care residences, Wi-Fi through the building. And so when people came to have their visitors, because we stopped visitors, not everybody could go and have one of those scenes where you tapped on the window and said hello to your grandmother. So we started to use iPads, because part of the problem was that since the rooms didn't have Wi-Fi in them, an iPad was no good. And so we've now have to go about installing Wi-Fi in all those homes in every room, so that next time something has gone on that causes a lockdown, people can use the iPads to at least communicate with their family, which, as you would know, is very important to a lot of those elderly people who are maybe a bit disoriented to begin with and need to have the comfort of their relatives, even to be with them on an iPad if they can't be there in person.
Great, wonderful. So I'm going to just turn the focus around a little bit to you.
Sure.
Prior to becoming mayor, what was the best job or position you had that has given you some really good skills in dealing with today's pandemic?
I was so lucky to have so many interesting jobs. And it's funny, I can say at age almost 66 that I've enjoyed every job I've ever had. They had different levels of stress and strain depending on what was going on. That's like everybody's job. The one I would say was the best for me in terms of learning, and because he was a wonderful boss and because it allowed me to get experience in dealing with a wide range of issues, including crises, was when I was principal secretary to Premier Bill Davis. I did that when I was very young. I was 26, so I was looking after his political staff and his principal advisor when I was 26 until I was 30. But to have a chance to work for a man like him who was patient, he was unflappable, he was, wise in his exercise of judgment, which he recognized was the principal job of a leader, is to exercise judgment and to reassure people and to communicate to them. And I watched him do that. And it was a job that, because he was such a wonderful man to work for, I also enjoyed it. But I've enjoyed every job I've had. That would be the one, though, that I would say was the one I learned the most from. that I enjoyed, but I've enjoyed every single job I've had without exception, including this one.
Oh, great. So I'm going to ask you to rank them a little bit. The question is, what are your top 3 dream jobs aside from being the mayor?
Well, one I had, and I would go back to it because I had so much fun doing it and I enjoyed it. And I had to learn to do it. I say to kids all the time, I address a lot of audiences and students, and I say to them, don't be afraid, and young people generally, I say, don't be afraid to change jobs. I've changed jobs. Like I had 5 completely different careers, all very different than each other. And the one that I sort of knew probably the least about when I started it was to be a talk show host. Now I knew how to talk, as evidenced by me sitting in front of you today. I knew how to talk, but talking on the radio for 3 hours and not running out of things to say, and hopefully doing it in a way that interests people and keeps them listening. Because if you stop having listeners, they stop having you as an employee, I assure you, and they monitor it electronically every single day. But I enjoyed that job immensely because it was kind of fun to have the latitude. And I now, of course, go back to be a guest on those shows, and they start peppering me with questions and remind me of the fact that I used to talk without any fear of accountability for anything I said, because you can sit there and say whatever you want as long as you don't libel somebody. So I would say that job was the most fun. It was very interesting. I got to deal with issues I find to be of enjoyment. But as I said earlier on, I've enjoyed every job I've had. And then I guess my second and third choices after that today, given where I find myself in my life, I actually have said to many of our parks people, they will bear witness to this, that I would probably even pay for the privilege of being able to drive a Zamboni on our rinks around the city. Doesn't every young Canadian dream about driving the Zamboni? And I'm still at it, even at my advanced age. And then thirdly, and perhaps slightly more seriously, I would like to bring my acquired experiences and skills to the benefit of some boards again. But I realize I'm going to be at an age where, they're looking for people who are in their 40s and 50s and not older. But I think you bring some wisdom and experience to some boards, and it's kind of a nice way to kind of tail your career down. I'm nowhere near interested in retiring. So I either stay in this job, which if the voters choose to have me stay, and if my wife lets me, or I take on some assignments like that. And of course, I would get heavily involved again in the charity end of things, because I was always involved in 2 or 3 fundraising campaigns at a time because I enjoyed it. And I found it to be something where you could get a lot of satisfaction out of it. So talk show host, Zamboni driver, board member, and a charitable fundraiser. And that'll probably look after the rest of the time when I'm able to get up and about and be active in the community.
Well, when you're ready, there's a spot for you on the JNF Toronto board, I can tell you that.
Well, there you go.
Okay, question is, for university students, do you think, what do you think school will look like for them in September? And what about those that are coming from out of town? Can they go into residence? Like, is that going to be a possibility?
Well, these are unknowns at the moment. Residences often can be okay if you have a single room, or, even sometimes the double room is physically distanced enough that you're, well beyond 6 feet from your roommate. And, it kind of depends. We're looking at September, and I certainly hope the health situation is much better by then. I think it's more the teaching end of it that will be different. I mean, look, to be frank about this, the universities, as you all know, and the colleges rely heavily on international students economically and financially. And so the notion that they'd have to sort of not have those people coming, if people are traveling again by then, it would be a real blow to them financially. But so I think, everybody will try, the health numbers permitting, to accommodate some of that. And of course, many of those people live in residence. I think the bigger difference will be on the teaching side, where it was said to me even yesterday, because we've been talking to the universities about how many students will be on the transit system. Remember, I mentioned that's one of my major sort of sources of paranoia. If everybody came back to work and back to school all at once, and you had, from today's 500,000, you had once again 1.6 million people a day on the transit system, we would have a circumstance that we would be unable to meaningfully deal with physical distancing. And that's one of the reasons you're going to hear us say today, like literally this afternoon, a couple of hours from now, we are saying to people, you are strongly recommended to wear a face covering if you are traveling on public transit, because as it gets more and more back to normal ridership levels, there is no way you can have 6 feet between every person on the public transit. The universities, it'll be the same thing. These kinds of giant classes that I can really not put into any context, because I was lucky enough when I went to university to have our big classes consist of 25 people and the tutorials consisted of 6, where you actually got to sit with the professor and have a talk about things. It's not going to be a problem for the tutorials, the 6 people. It's going to be a problem for the convocation hall classes they have now with 1,500 students in Poli-Sci 101. And so I think that's going to have to be rethought. And they're talking to us because we want to know not so much how they teach school, we want to know how many kids are they going to have going to the U of T campus or the York campus or the Humber College campus, because it allows us to plan for the transit. And I think they're going to have fewer students coming less often and have more learning done electronically, just because it's a way of stopping the spread of the virus again and taking account of our concerns about things like public transit.
Okay, so just another question or two. And just a reminder, everyone, that if you do have a question, please indicate it in the chat. I'll try to get to it. I know this is a question that I've been concerned about myself. When do you think hair salons and nail salons will open?
I think in the next, yeah, I think, yeah, look, well, look at, see, I've been cutting my own hair, which you should give a try to. And I haven't touched the back, but I can do the sides just with that. I actually went and bought a pair of those thinning scissors, and I would recommend it if you're careful to any of you that you could keep it under control, which I've tried to do. But I think the answer to that question is in the next round. I think obviously you'll understand, people will, that when you have someone standing as close to you as someone that's cutting or coloring or dealing with your hair, they're very, very close. And so that again, when this business of the virus spreading has to be taken into account, they've got to have a whole series of rules, and there will be a lot of people going to those places and a lot of them that open. I think of all the nail salons there are across the city. So I think it was under discussion for this first round that just happened a couple of days ago. So that means it'll be under discussion for the second round and much more likely to happen at that time, mostly for health reasons, because it will be deemed safe, but I think also because people are getting anxious about getting their haircut or about getting their nails fixed or whatever they do. So I think it'll be in the next round. And if you said when's that, I've said before, I think that's going to be in June sometime, like about a month from last week. That's my guess at the moment.
And I think that basically wraps up, unless anyone has any final questions. I think we're good. So let me, Mayor Tory, let me really thank you so much, first of all, for your leadership. The leadership you've shown and over the last.
When his kids can go to go see their friends.
Please put your question into the chat.
I did.
Okay. Debbie, what was your question?
When is kids allowed to see their friends?
Oh, okay. Mayor, get that?
Well, I think that has to do with this question was asked earlier on about the bubbles and bringing people together. And I think it'll be a while. My guess is you might see some relief on that by the fall. But if you think about it for a minute, having kids see their friends in groups of 10 on the street in front of your house is really the same set of questions we face with the day camps. I mean, the challenge of managing children and keeping them from being in too close quarters with one another when there's a chance that one of them could be carrying the virus unknowingly is the risk that we're having to assess. And so you've heard the Premier say, and you've heard me say, that we think by not earlier than mid-July we'll be in a position to have some summer camps that have physically distancing considerations taken into account. It would stand to reason that by then you also can't say to kids, well, you can go to a day camp, but you can't play with your friends. So I would think you're looking at a time period like that, which is later in June or mid-July at the earliest, but I think you'll see it by then. That's my guess. It depends very much on the health numbers, and if they keep improving, I think you'll definitely see some movement on that in June, possibly earlier than what I've said.
And one final question. The pandemic has obviously caused a major drain on city resources financially. Where do you think the shortfall is going to be made up?
Well, I think it'll be made up of a combination of measures we take within the government itself, hopefully not involving cutbacks to services directly affecting people, but just economies we can achieve and monies that we can kind of repurpose. The shortfall, I'll tell you the numbers because you are the people whose money it is, not mine. The shortfall this year is projected to be, if the shutdown lasts for 3 months, which means to the end of June, and then the recovery period lasts until the end of the year, so another essentially 6 months after that, the shortfall in revenues for the City of Toronto will be $1.5 billion. The $1.5 billion, the biggest, when you say, well, how could you possibly get to a number that big? Take the transit system. The shortfall in ridership that I mentioned, going from 1.6 million a day to 500,000, is costing us about $22 million a week. So we're what, 8 weeks into this already, I think. So that's already close to $200 million just for that. The loss for the TTC by Labor Day is estimated to be at 500 million. So there's a third of the $1.5 billion just to Labor Day. So where it's going to come from, I think we'll find some of it from those sources that I mentioned that the city itself can, repurpose money. The other amounts I think will have to come from the other governments, because the alternative to that of them supporting us, they being the governments that benefit from income tax, corporate tax, and sales tax, of which we get none. We get only the property taxes and land transfer taxes, is that we would have to cut services or dramatically increase property taxes, because we can't run a deficit. And I'm happy about that. I don't think we should be able to run one, but we can't run one, so that doesn't represent a solution. So just to give you an idea, the kind of property tax increase we'd have to eliminate that $1.5 billion shortfall would be 30%, a 30% increase in property taxes. On the service side, we would literally have to lay off thousands of transit drivers, which means huge cuts to transit service, or we'd have to stop our subsidy for childcare for people who are lower income that are working but need our help paying for childcare. So I think none of those are really appealing or acceptable options, which is why you've heard me pressing so hard to the other governments to say they have to step up and help us, cities across the country, including Toronto, to get rid of this cash revenue shortfall for 2020. And then we'll be back on our feet and able to lead the recovery across the country, because 80% of Canadians, of course, live in cities.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one more question. Is there a timetable for the return of arts and culture, concerts, galleries, sporting events?
Very much related to the previous answers. I mean, the sporting events, we have proposals in front of us from pretty much all the major league sports to perhaps be doing something in Toronto, but every one of them says without fans, because they know that there's no chance we're going to be filling up the Rogers Centre with 50,000 people on a nice day to see the Yankees come to play. Same with the Leafs. I mean, they're in some consideration, I gather. I know that they are, because they told us to have games played at Scotiabank Arena, but with no fans there. And so I think the notion of big sporting events with fans present, not going to happen probably through the end of the year. Concerts or the film festival, I think if they can work out a way, quite frankly, where you eliminate the mob scene going in with all the lineups, and you eliminate people sitting shoulder to shoulder in the theater, so they sit every second or third seat, which affects the business model of those concerts, you could see some of those come back. Arts and culture in a kind of a broader way, I think what you see is a lot of creative thought going into that, as you might expect from the arts and culture community. And they're having things like drive-through art exhibits and drive-in concerts. There's going to be one of those coming up. So I think you'll see some ingenuity to try and have some element of arts and culture come back. But I think if the more traditional settings for things and the more traditional way of doing it, you're going to see it again into the fall, because it's a crowd scene. And we're trying to not have crowd scenes, especially ones you can't very easily manage. You can manage crowd scenes that are in a confined space with lineups and things like that. But if it's kind of a free for all where people are going around looking at an art exhibition, it's harder to deal with people. So I think the fall would be my guess.
Okay. So once again, Mayor, thank you so much for your leadership and for
Jeff, thank you.
Making yourself available to us today. It's really most appreciated. And thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you at some future JNF programs over the next several weeks. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.